So how was
Big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leis.
Well, it's Thursday, November 21, 2024, the year of our Lord. It's David Leis here, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and a warm welcome to everybody for joining us today for this live conversation about a number of things, and really it's about Trump 2.0. What do you think? Did you hear there's an election on November 5? And golly, there's a lot of changes in the works, or at least it appears to be. So a good afternoon to everybody in our audience. Good afternoon to you, Prairie. And so, just climb on board. We are really excited about our conversation as usual. I've got a very special guest. And before I introduce Leighton Grey from Grey Matter and the world of law and other worlds of public policy, I wanted to just talk about some headlines. It's always interesting. Every Thursday, we climb on board here on Leaders, and we talk about, I think, some very important issues. And so we really appreciate everyone's feedback and questions, comments, and golly, there's a lot going on. I just picked up yesterday the International Criminal Court in The Hague has issued warrants for, well, a number of people like Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and of course different Hamas leaders. So what's that about? What do you think is going on there as they serve those kinds of warrants? Maybe that would be a good question for our guest, Leighton Grey. It's interesting, Blacklocks, and if you're not familiar with Blacklocks, it's a great, very factual-oriented newsletter. It's all about the facts, and you can subscribe to that. But it's very interesting. They just released yesterday a confidential federal document, a memo within the bowels of the bureaucracy in the federal government that 350 criminal gangs are involved in turning out wholesale production and trading of fentanyl, one of the deadliest drugs out there. It's done horrific damage in terms of loss of life. But the document says Canada is now a source and transit country for fentanyl, a net exporter. So go figure. And also in the news, we probably heard about the Liberal government's announcement that has just come out, I believe, this morning, that they're looking at reducing or eliminating the GST temporarily for 2 months, I believe, if this is accurate, on a number of items from toys and restaurant meals. And they will be sending us each as Canadians, if below, I think it's the $150,000 threshold, $250 checks. So that's part of their multi-billion-dollar affordability initiative. I find this so ironic on so many levels, as the government has created so much inflation and this affordability wreck in the first place. So remember, inflation doesn't come from you, the consumer, or the producer. It comes from having too much money supply circulating in the economy. And the other news related to that is that economists are now weighing in on the inflation report, where inflation is edging up again. So we'll see whether or not the Bank of Canada can make another cut in its basis points. Maybe it's 25, maybe it's 50. What do you think? So those are very important issues because it relates to everybody's Canadians' life, especially as they go about their days, as they put gas in their tank, as they renew their mortgages. We've also noticed that we are in the 6th day of a postal strike. Have you noticed it? What do you think is going to happen here? How is that going to pan out? That's another good question with our guest. And I also noticed that we have a federal cabinet minister that has resigned yesterday, Randy Bissonnette, if I pronounce it correctly, and we'll get to that in a moment as well as we catch up on issues. So, again, a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us as we talk about this very important topic. Coming out of the November U.S. elections, there's been a lot discussed about this on Frontier. You may have noticed actually a program that was recorded, frankly, a few weeks ago with Jim Lakely, a vice president and at the Heartland Institute, as well as a former journalist that's covered Congress and also the White House. And I think it was, in retrospect, a very good conversation. And I'd encourage you to look at that. So my guest is a great friend and colleague. His name is Leighton Grey. And warm welcome to you, Leighton, for joining us from Grey Matter. How are you today?
I'm well. Thanks for asking. It's my pleasure to be on your program. Looking forward to our conversation.
So, Leighton, you are a man of many talents. You used to play hockey. Gosh, maybe we played hockey together years ago. I don't know. On opposing teams, probably.
Did you ever get elbowed in the head during a game? If not, then you didn't play against me.
I did not have that misfortune. So you were Mr. Elbow, I suspect. That was one of your moves, was it, Leighton? But no, I have so much respect for what you do, Leighton. And you're also a constitutional lawyer. And so you bring a lot of perspective on the world of Canada and what's going on in this country. And I know you care deeply about this nation. And so I'm delighted. So I can't resist, but this sixth day of a postal strike, how is this going to be resolved? Like it's fascinating to me. Like, are they in binding arbitration yet where they really have to be put in a room? Because this is, I think, a pretty important service, the Postal Service. I missed the mail already. What about you, Leighton? Where is this headed? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I got to know the collective bargaining agreements that exist between the Canadian government and postal workers pretty well during the course of a case that I handled. Lasted about 2.5 years, where we had actually sued the federal government and Canada Post over its vaccine mandates. And the short answer is yes, there are arbitration procedures within the collective bargaining agreements, but they don't favor workers very much. The workers really, and this is, I think, why they're in a strike situation, really that's their go-to move, is just to refuse to work. There is legislative provision for the federal government to order them back to work. They are an essential service, but I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. As you know, this Liberal government is besieged on all fronts, so much so that, as you pointed out off the top of the show, they're trying to give away, what would you call it, Christmas candy money, which isn't even their money. Some would say, more cynically, their vote buying. But I don't think they can afford at this point to be heavy-handed with Canada Post. Having said that, some of the demands on the Canada Post side are pretty incredible. Some of the wage increases they're seeking. I mean, honestly, some of these postal workers would get paid better than most Canadian doctors if their demands were met. So I think that the strike is going to go on for a while yet.
Okay, wow. So stay tuned as this strike unfolds. Let's hope it's resolved earlier. But gosh, maybe this sounds like a symptom of deeper issues in terms of, in the age of email and an awful lot of prime vans I see running around in neighborhoods.
Yes.
Whether, I don't know, like what's the future of the Postal Service? Is that kind of a question that's crossed your mind? I know at the Frontier, we don't like public monopolies. In some cases, there's good reason, but, in this one, maybe what is the future of the Postal Service if they keep going on strike?
Well, I think its days are numbered. I mean, just as the Pony Express and the Telegraph eventually went the way of the dodo, I think the idea that you're going to have mail delivered physically to you is coming to an end. In most places, you no longer get the mail delivered directly to your door, as was commonplace when back in the 1850s when you and I were kids, David. It has transformed very much over the past couple of decades, and I think it's going to change even more. I think the current model is unsustainable. It's too costly, and it's grossly inefficient. And as you rightly point out, there are so many other modes of transmitting documents and things like that to people that it begs the question of whether or not there is a need for a traditional postal service. It certainly had its time, it had its day, but I'm not certain that the need is there, particularly given what it costs the taxpayer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So stay tuned on that one. I did want to reflect on a few other headlines, and it's interesting. We've got some comments from Lisa Wilcox. We might see something private like Uber mail service. Very good point, Lisa. Like the whole idea that you have truly revolutionary platform businesses that can enter the market. And, gosh, that's a good question or good statement, Lisa. And then Prairie says 100% grossly inefficient. I assume that refers to the post office. So, yeah, very interesting issue. On other issues, this whole recent, the International Criminal Court issuing warrants for a variety of leaders, including the Prime Minister of Israel. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what's going on here? Who do these international courts think they are? I thought when we last checked in the Middle East, we are having multiple wars, and it's an ugly tragedy. What's your comment on that, Leighton?
Well, it's my opinion based upon the research that I've done, and I think it's tangibly obvious. If you look at organizations like the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the UN itself, sadly, UNESCO, and also the International Court that you described, that these are all avatars for the Chinese Communist Party. That these are media through which the Chinese Communist Party tries to extend its hegemony, which really is an offense to everything that is American and Western. And many of the threads that we deal with that Professor Godsod calls idea pathogens are communicated through these different media, but the eye of Sauron is clearly the CCP. And this court really is nothing more than an avatar for them. The idea that you would issue a warrant for a world leader, a respected world leader, who's in the midst of a war where essentially he's in charge of a country that's defending its sovereignty, defending its borders, surrounded on all sides by hostile nations, and one that is not even a nation. We should remember Palestine is not a nation. Iran certainly is, and that these these enemies of Israel are truly terrorists. We're talking about Hamas, Hezbollah. These are all terrorist organizations. These are not international nations. They're not members of the United Nations. Unfortunately, the political left, driven by China, frankly, has captured organizations like the International Criminal Court. And so, unfortunately, in terms of a justice engine or a way of affecting international justice, this court really has no teeth, and I don't think it should be taken seriously.
Okay, very interesting commentary by our special guest today, Leighton Grey, constitutional lawyer, the host of Grey Matter. What do you think? It's very interesting issues that are going on around us, and so it behooves us to open our eyes. And these are all, interestingly enough, related to our topic when it comes to understanding the impact of the election of Donald Trump 2.0. Now, it's been a very interesting election. I know that I'm a person of statistics. I almost did a Freudian slip of statistics. But the whole issue is that, I follow very closely. I'm a big fan of Rasmussen polls. There's some other, I think, very good pollsters out there, but there's an awful lot that are terrible pollsters. But it was a remarkable election from many points of view. And just right off the top, we've got the GOP captured the popular vote. They got the electoral college, and they got the House in terms of the Congress. They also got the Senate, and they got the White House. So that's a trifecta. As you are able to create really what was a stunning victory. Were you surprised by the electoral outcome, Leighton?
I was not, and I was not for two main reasons. Number one, the more we saw of Kamala Harris, the more obvious it became that this person could never become president. She just got worse and worse, and her campaign at the end became really pathetic when they started paying millions of dollars to twerking celebrities and Oprah Winfrey and all these other people to try and save the election for her. But I think in the end it became really obvious that she was just not a winning candidate. The other reason why is kind of a personal one, and that is I happened to be in Henderson, Nevada, about a month ago, right before the election, about a week before, and just as a fluke, it was God's hand was working. I was there on my last day visiting my son in Las Vegas. He's playing hockey down there, and I had nothing to do. And I went downstairs and I asked the hotel concierge, what is there to do today around Las Vegas? He goes, well, sir, there's a Trump rally right across the street. And so
Across the street.
Across the street. So I stepped outside and I followed a man in a blue suit and orange hair and a bright red tie who was not Donald Trump, who was trying very hard to look like Donald Trump. And I stood in an arena of about 20,000 people. And I was in a group of about, roughly 250 people holding hands and praying that Donald Trump would win. And it was at that time, in that place, in that personal moment, that I got MAGA. I actually understood what MAGA is. And MAGA is not what we're told it is on CNN or Fox or anywhere else. It is a truly authentic conservative movement. And it's hooked into the soul of a nation, particularly rural Americans, everyday hardworking Americans of every stripe and color, but especially those who are Christian. It has a particular Christian flavor, character to it, which of course is core to conservatism, true conservatism, in my view, at least in a classical view. And it was through that experience and in the aftermath of it that I became convinced that this was a movement that simply could not be stopped. And so that's a long-winded way of saying no, I wasn't surprised. But I'm very intrigued to think about what this is going to mean, not only for America, but also for the rest of the world, not least of whom are those of us who live in what sometimes is called America's top hat, otherwise known as Canada.
Yeah, indeed. So that's a very interesting experience as you're minding your own business around the hotel lobbies and you wonder what is there to do, and all of a sudden in the wink of an eye you go to a rally to see it in person. So that sounds like a little bit of history there, Leighton. And so this is the point, is how do we understand what the Making America Great Again movement is? See, it strikes me that, certainly in Canada at least, I've noticed that the legacy media has, frankly, I think, totally bought into the legacy media from the United States, which I would argue is largely a narrative of the Democratic Party, not entirely, but largely. And so it's almost like, I'm not assuming we understand what MAGA is all about. Is it a white supremacist movement? Is it a Christian nationalist movement? Like, there's a lot of labels, including almost like this, like we've been trained to hate Donald Trump. Like, and he's got this heavy Queen's accent and all the rest, but a lot of Canadians, frankly, aren't on board with MAGA at all. I mean, maybe it's 25, 30%. I don't know. I mean, there's different polls around that. So what is MAGA really about?
Well, I think you're right. I think it's largely misunderstood. I think that the media, you quite rightly state, is largely responsible for this. The short answer to the question, what is MAGA? In my view, is this. It is a response, a global response, which is originating in America, but it is a global response to globalism. And I think it underestimates MAGA to say that is particular to America. And the reason why is you see the response in places like Japan, places like Hungary, Serbia, many nations throughout the world, Argentina, El Salvador, all basically joining hands and being very, very supportive of MAGA and of the Trump administration and what it stands for. Now, that is going to be a very interesting thing, not only for Canada but also for the rest of the world. It's very clear, I think, when you listen to what Mr. Trump and members of his new administration are saying, is that what MAGA stands for is a rejection of all the many points of globalism, of globalist ideology, which have dominated politics and really life throughout the West, especially over the past 5 to 10 years. The Biden administration was fully bought into all of this. Trudeau has been fully bought into this from day one. You see Mr. Starmer in Great Britain, Mr. Macron in France. And of course, we know what these things are. This is climate catastrophe. This is the woke ideology, critical race theory, diversity, inclusion, equity, all of this stuff, which has led to incredible conflict in the world. We're on the precipice right now, sadly, of World War III. There are many people right now who are concerned that Russia is threatening to unleash nuclear strikes on parts of the United States and foreseeably other targets in the West. And I think what MAGA is a response to all of that. It seeks to end the madness of that. To making America great again is not just about making America great again. It's an attempt to restore some balance and some peace in the world that we have not seen for a very long time. Mr. Trump has said many times that the reason why he's in this, the reason why he sought re-election to the presidency, is because he wants the world to be peaceful. He's a father and a grandfather, and he's concerned about the future of the world, the state of the world, and he wants there to be global peace. And it's the position of MAGA and its supporters that simply isn't possible under current conditions that are extant in the world today.
Okay, so that's a sweeping overview, Leighton. I really appreciate it. So to our audience, I'm talking with Leighton Grey, the host of Grey Matter and a constitutional lawyer and certainly a keen observer of the political scene both in Canada and elsewhere, including the United States. We're talking about the Make America Great agenda. And, it's interesting. So there's a number of clues here, if I'm hearing you correctly. So from your point of view, this election was historic from many angles in the sense that this was not just the election of a, quote, political party. It was about a political movement, a conservative movement of sorts. And so it's kind of a symptom of something deeper, a history, the roots of events that just didn't happen yesterday. They've been going on for a number of years. I know that one of the things I've observed in poll after poll here of pollsters that I trust, like Rasmussen, is the three primary issues overwhelmingly that brought the election home for the GOP was number one was affordability, the concern that, the middle class is being destroyed, inflation and all the rest. Secondly was open borders, a flood of illegal migrants into the United States. And the Biden administration was clearly facilitating that. It's almost bizarre, and that's a whole nother discussion. And thirdly, areas of culture. And I think you alluded to that as well. I think it's so those three primary things. But a lot of this, the tone of it seemed to be what you're saying is that people reacting to the sense that the middle class is being destroyed, that people want a voice. They want to get rid of this kind of corrupt and incompetent elite that
Mhm.
has ruled the United States for years, gotten involved in endless wars, like Iraq is a good example,
Right.
and they'll be damned to send their sons and daughters into conflict, all to help move forward the budget for an endless array of defense contractors who benefit from these endless wars. And
Mhm.
it begs the question, why are we dying for elites that don't go to war?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
this is, I think, part of the snapshot of this too, isn't it? Like they want to
It
take back
is.
their country, and that involves kind of traditional values that we'd recognize.
Yeah. No, this is very true. However, again, it underestimates MAGA to say that it's insular to the United States. Mr. Trump has been very clear that MAGA and his administration is aspirational in terms
Hmm.
of asserting American dominance, American hegemony throughout the world. He's
Hmm.
talked about how he's going to settle the Ukraine Russia conflict. He's talked about
Hmm.
how America is going to intervene and settle the Israeli Palestine conflict. And this is of importance to Canadians, both he and members of his cabinet to be very unusually and somewhat historically have expressed very strong comments about Canada. And I don't know if you saw the recent biopic movie about Ronald Reagan, David, but it's pretty good.
Yes, I
It
did.
stars, stars Dennis Quaid in the starring role as Ronald Reagan. And so I went back and I did some reading about Ronald Reagan. I found a kind of a chestnut where Ronald Reagan, he was inaugurated in 1981, and he represented a strain of sort of hawkish free market conservatism that was at the time was the ideological antithesis of then Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And nevertheless, at first, the two got along great. In fact, Reagan wrote in his memoirs, he said, went to Parliament Hill to meet PM Trudeau, discovered that I liked him.
Yes,
But
that's right.
this new Trump cabinet presently taking shape seems to really, really hate Justin Trudeau.
Hmm.
U.S. administrations usually lack strong opinions about Canada, but not this time. Donald Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Marco Rubio, Matt Gaetz, who apparently has stepped aside, but
Hmm.
and Mark Homan, the new border czar, have all expressed strong negative opinions about the current Canadian leader. And so, as Trump fills out his cabinet, it's becoming clearer his appointees see the Trudeau government as the emblem of everything they oppose. And getting back to my comments about globalism, the Canadian government has really become an avatar for that globalism. And so there's a serious question here about how is this going to affect Canada? Because
Hmm.
maybe for the first time since 1812, the United States sees Canada as a geopolitical threat to the safety and security of the United States. And so, one question to be asked is, well, what is that going to mean? Is the United States going to take more of a more sincere scrutinizing interest in the domestic politics of Canada? How is that going to impact trade? People might remember back in February 22, Donald Trump was giving a speech at CPAC. He described Justin Trudeau as an authoritarian dictator, and Donald Trump promised to free Canadians from the tyranny of this dictator. This is not language that we've ever seen before in my lifetime, certainly, from an American president.
Okay,
Why?
so you're
Why
you're
is the
you're
U.S. so interested in
surmising.
Canada? Yeah.
Okay, so perhaps you're onto something here. I mean, the United States is our close friend and neighbor, ally, and you're suggesting that, gosh, maybe we're on a divergent path from a policy perspective, and not only that, to top it off, there's some interpersonal dynamics where people don't appreciate each other.
Mhm.
But from a policy point of view, we're on very different paths as nations here. Is that what you're getting at? So we could stand
Yes.
to lose a lot here as a country. Is that right?
Yes, and also there may be a lot to gain. Um, what we're seeing right now, and this is something that I've never seen before in my lifetime, David, is the American administration, the Trump administration, is looking at Canada and drawing a distinction between the people, the Canadian people like you and me, and those who are listening and watching your show, and our government. Much in the same way that previous administrations drew a distinction between Fidel Castro and the Cuban people, the way some people might draw a distinction between Xi Jinping or the North Korean dictator and the people of those countries. And so this is something that the Americans are doing. And basically what it's saying is that the Trump administration views the Canadian government with suspicion, with disregard, and with concern that it poses a threat not only to Canadians but to the United States and to Western hegemony. And of course, given Canada's close connections to China and Justin Trudeau's antagonism of many Western leaders, including Donald Trump, which is continuing, by the way. He recently was out in front at international conferences saying that other leaders are coming to him for advice about how to deal with Donald Trump. I mean, try not to laugh. But that's the antagonism that Justin Trudeau has set up for us in relation to countries like Russia, India, the United States, up and coming rising powers in the world, on the world stage, like Argentina under the leadership of Javier Milei, who's just performing absolute miracles in Argentina right now, completely turned that country around in a matter of 6 months. To me, that's joyful to see that, because it shows that if we get the right leadership, Conrad Black is right, that if Canada just had proper leadership, what could we be? We could be a world superpower.
Indeed. So, audience, what do you think? Do you think Leighton Grey is onto something here? What do you sense are the implications of a Trump 2.0 administration across the board, both in the House, the Senate, and in the White House? So, Leighton, you bring up a lot of, I think, very profound points, because there's a lot at stake here. And I can think of many examples. If we think, for example, of tax policy, certainly we've had conversations here on this program with senior advisors on the economic side, like Steve Moore, about tax policy that the administration will pursue. And it's really, well stated. It's about low taxation. It's about getting rid of regulation, getting rid of bloated government. It's profoundly unleashing the opportunities for growth, including energy. Right. So I can see a scenario where, as they pursue this agenda, Canada really will be on a very different path of prosperity. Right now, if we look at just the figures of family income in Ontario, it is almost 20,000 less than one of the lowest performing states in the United States, named Arkansas. So you have a situation where I think that difference in prosperity is going to be very different, because historically our nations have been more or less, if you go back some 50 decades, and I can show you the statistics, our standards of living have been relatively similar, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but kind of on a similar path. But we're on a great divergent path as our productivity levels continue to decline in our standard of living. And I think that, and I guess my punchline is that money flows downhill just like water. And so if you have a very attractive economy that is growing, prospering, that attracts not only all the money for business investment, but also the people. And I think this is where, you got to build a team, a strong team in Canada, and you've got to do that with good public policy, let alone on the tax side. What do you think, Leighton?
Well, I think this is an excellent point, and it really begs the question, is there a truly conservative movement in Canada? Is there something equivalent or similar to MAGA in Canada right now? If there is, I don't see it. I don't sense it. Even in Alberta, which is my home province, I think could be at least casually, perhaps critically regarded as the most small C conservative province in Canada. Certainly the most American-like in its thinking. Our government right now, we've had almost 800 days of Danielle Smith's leadership, and people are still waiting for a tax break. This government is still growing and expanding. They're about to bring in government insurance.
No kidding.
They are spending a lot of money, more money than the Rachel Notley NDP government did. They're
How is that
bullish.
possible?
They're bullish on immigration. Um, and of course that's on fiscal policy. But on social policy, for example, you saw in the United States Matt Johnson come out and say very clearly, a man is a man, as a woman is a woman, and neither the twain shall meet except in holy matrimony. Well, yesterday, the feminist minister for arts and culture and women's issues, which are strangely bound together in one ministry in Alberta, came out and posted a message about transgender Day of Remembrance. So really, it begs the question: how conservative is the UCP, even in Canada? And then when you look at the nationally at the CPC, and Mr. Poilievre, his slogan is "Axe the Tax." I think you can make an argument that in some ways he's fiscally conservative, but still supports government constructing houses, still supports mass immigration. And in terms of culturally conservative, well, his two capos, one of them is a foreign national and the other is a strong LGBTQ rights activist. So, it really begs the question, when you look at the Liberal Party of Canada and the CPC, is it Cold Wars? Is it Coke versus Pepsi? I don't see anything in Canada right now even close to what MAGA is, resembling what MAGA is. And I'm curious to know why. This is something that I'm really following closely to see whether perhaps we will get caught up in the slipstream of MAGA. Perhaps we might see, for example, Mr. Poilievre's party turn and sort of follow the slipstream of the Trump administration, much the way Brian Mulroney's government did very successfully during the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was in power. And of course, that was a very prosperous time for Canada, right up until the time when Mulroney blew up the party. But I mean, sorry to Brian Mulroney fans, but it's going to be very interesting to see, David, what is MAGA going to mean for Canada? What are tariffs going to mean? What's going to happen when the United States gets back to being energy independent and fracking and producing a lot of oil? As Canada, as the government of Canada tries to suppress and destroy its own oil and gas industry. Very, very interesting questions coming forward for Canadians.
Indeed. So I've got a number of comments, Leighton, from the audience, including Ruth McNeil, who says, I think it will be good for Canada. We just need to get rid of this government. I think that is very much in line with
Amen,
your
Ruth.
observation. Change of policy.
Ruth gets a big salute from me in terms of getting rid of it.
A big salute from Leighton to Ruth. And Prairie says, yep, happening here as well, Transgender Day of Awareness. So, yeah, I think, but I think you make a very interesting point, and this is something that is, I think, very important to understand strategically, is that culture, how we behave and treat each other in day-to-day life, is upstream, ahead of, and frames up policy.
Right.
So in Canada, I think what you're getting at is that it seems like our governments, even if they're in name of, quote, conservative or more traditional, I don't want to be too much of a generalist here, or generalizing too much, but the point is that it seems like our culture in Canada is even more embedded in our institutions of this woke, radically progressive cultural socialism. I mean, there's different words I can use, but they're very important words as it relates to I mean, this is such a large topic, but in Canada, I think part of our culture is that people are generally very nice people. And so when there's a kind of a manipulation of the idea that, well, these people are victims, so we've got to always be on their side without any questions asked, it's almost like an emotional leading of the argument. It's a manipulation of our compassion. And then so many Canadians just go along with it. And obviously, we've got to have compassion for people, but it's got to be based on truth. Even things like what are called science. So things like the Cass report in the UK by this preeminent pediatrician that did a meta-analysis, a massive research document, which I've had the pleasure of reading, is a utter eye-opener as it finds out this gender affirmation approach is utter bunk.
Yeah.
And yet our countries, our governments that we have trust in, and I think that's another thing, is Canadians tend to have a lot of trust in government, and perhaps we need to be, like so many Americans, maybe a little bit more skeptical of governments and say, well, what they're saying isn't actually based on science or facts. So we need to use our critical thinking skills. Anyways, I could go on and on about this, Leighton, but I think you're onto something, is that in Canada, do you think it's too late to turn this around? Are we too much of an outlier now? I know that in many respects, Canada is an international outlier on so many issues. We're kind of seen as a kind of a radical woke nation now. It's kind of pathetic.
Well, it's disappointing because my answer to your question is no, I don't think it's too late for Canada. I agree with Conrad Black. If you read his book, The Canadian Manifesto,
Yes.
he thinks that Canada's best days are ahead of us. And I quite agree. I think that the strength of Canada is in our people. And
Right
we still have great people in our country. But our potential is being deliberately suppressed because we have a federal government that very clearly, in a systemic way, is not acting in the best interest of its own citizens. You know, when we see a federal government that is deeply in debt, that has piled up more debt than every single Canadian government in the history of this country combined in 9 short years, and then is borrowing money to send it over to Ukraine to support a foreign war. That's just one example of this type of ridiculous, absurd, destructive spending that's destroying our country. When you see that, it's very clear evidence that we have a government that is acting against our best interests. If we had a government that was acting in the best interests of Canadians and promoting our interests, as the Trump administration aspires to do, and I think you have put your finger on the secret formula, and that is, listen, Justin Trudeau is not going to do it, but at some point, some Canadian government, the federal government, is going to have to come along and do the things that you've said. And that is, they're going to have to cut the size of the public service, which has increased 43% under Justin Trudeau. They're going to have to reduce spending, and they're going to have to get serious about reducing our national debt and cutting taxes, because those are the things that we know will stimulate our economy. And, you know, I don't think it's going to matter whether it's a conservative or a liberal government. Remember, in the early 90s, when Jean Chrétien came in, and it pains me to say this, it hurts me to say this, even though he's a liberal, he was a pretty good prime minister, and he had one of the best finance ministers in my lifetime, Paul Martin, who was a much better finance minister than he was a prime minister. But he came in, and you remember, he cut. The Liberals cut, and they had to. And if we get a government in Ottawa, and I think we're going to have to, otherwise the country's going to become completely bankrupt. We've got a choice. We can turn the way the U.S. is, or we can become Venezuela. That's our future. But I don't think Canada is bound for the same territory as Venezuela. I think that our greatness is ahead of us. We just need some peace, order, and good government in Ottawa, and to do the things that you described that are essential to good governance. And I think that's the key. That's the secret that's going to unleash our potential as a nation.
Right on. So we've got some more questions from the audience. Thank you. We've got a question from it's not quite a name. It says DRK Zilla. How do we decrease the size of the public sector? What would you remove? I'm going to take a stab at that, if I may, Leighton, and count the ways. But a lot of this is, I think, from very thoughtful analysis has been done. Look at the Frontier website. It's truly exciting what we can do, and it kind of goes like this. Big government means for smaller citizens. So let us flip the table and let us work together to decrease the size of government and give the money, keep the money with the people. For example, in public education, open up innovative opportunities, a bit like Alberta, where they have these charter schools, give people school vouchers. That's happening in so many jurisdictions around the world, including in Sweden, where schools can be innovative and work for your trust and better serve you and your children. I mean, in healthcare, golly, there's so many opportunities, but it's a very important question. And that should be an opportunity for us to build a better nation. But it's empowering you to live your life in the way that you see fit, not through some woke bureaucracy that is wasting a lot of dollars in between. Like, I know that some political leaders have, including the leader of opposition, have even called for getting rid of the Indian Act. Why don't we get rid of the Indian Act? Free up the opportunity. I mean, you're of Aboriginal background as well, Leighton. I mean, how has the Indian Act served any Indigenous person in this country? Help me understand how has that helped.
Not very well. Of course, people who know their Canadian history know that Jean Chrétien and Justin Trudeau got in some trouble over this back in the late 60s with their white paper. But what you just said reminded me of a video I recently watched of the late, great University of Chicago economist, Nobel Prize winning Milton Friedman.
Yes.
And he was being introduced by Tom Robinson of the Hoover Institute. And Mr. Robinson asked Professor Friedman what he would do in order to shrink the size of government. And he went through 14 different government departments, federal government departments, and Professor Friedman shrunk them down to 4. And, it was just a totally rational approach, just the way you described. And that is, okay, let's look at these different ministries and ask the question, what do they do? What are they, right? What is in their essence, right? And then from there determine, well, do we need this? Because if you read, there's a great book by Albert Nock. It was written in 1935. People should check this out, called Our Enemy, the State. And Professor Nock said, and it was so true, it is in the nature of government, it is in the nature of the beast for it to grow. And what we're living through right now is the overgrowth of government.
Yes,
this
indeed.
Expanding government, both nationally and internationally. And coming back to our discussion of MAGA, MAGA is a reaction to that.
Yeah, right.
MAGA is an attempt to simplify government, and this is what Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk have been tasked with doing. But it's painful.
Sorry, who are the two guys again?
Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. They are going to, Ramaswamy is, that took me a lot to practice that one in front of a mirror. But he's a brilliant guy. He's a self-made billionaire. But they are part of this thing called DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. And they've got their chainsaws out, and they're going to cut government. And this is something that the United States government must do. They're in more public debt than Canada is. Private debt is a bigger problem for Canadians than for Americans. Americans have bigger public debt than us. But in any case, they're related, right? But we've got to reduce debt. We've got to reduce the size of government. That's what's killing our GDP based on the economists that I'm reading and I listen to. When we have 43% growth in our public sector, that's far too much.
Yeah. And that's been the majority of jobs created in Canada the last 10 years have been in the public sector, not the private sector. So that's a huge problem. I've got other comments here. Time to shave off the extra fat by Carrie. Welcome. Good point, Carrie.
Amen.
Gary says, dump the CRA. Okay, well, Let's be innovative here. Dare to think outside the box. Prairie says there was a great 7-part series here on YouTube, Sweden's U-turn on the transgender good watch. Okay.
Yeah.
We've got other comments. Every time I look at the number of federal and provincial ministers, I'm always surprised how many there are. Well,
And it's
come on, let's
growing.
use some common sense here. And
Yeah.
I think if I had to summarize it in a word, I'd say MAGA is really about common sense for the people, right? Putting the people back in charge, saying, we've got too big a government, let's get it down. Let's get people who are real people in charge, not these kind of deep state operatives that are always playing political games and spying on us domestically and all the rest. I mean, it's just crazy. So it's very interesting. I do want to pursue a little bit about culture just from a very interesting perspective, because I believe in statistics and evidence here. And if I look at data points, it's fascinating when we look at the election of Donald Trump, and that is, frankly, the dissolution of the traditional Democratic coalition of voters. And
Yes.
very specifically, you had a surge of people from groups such as Hispanics. Almost half of Hispanics in the country voted for Donald Trump. And you had a surge of people who were blacks, and particularly black men, that got onto the MAGA movement, and all kinds of other races. So this is so ironic, because you've had the legacy media say this MAGA movement is they're a bunch of racists, and in fact the Trump train is filled with people regardless of their race. And this is why the Democratic Party is kind of in deep trouble, because their traditional coalition, because no wonder they've beat the traditional drum of saying everybody's a racist. They've got to declare Donald Trump a racist because they want to make sure that their pot of voters sticks together.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of a significant tidal wave of change within the electoral vote. Is it not, Leighton?
Oh, I agree. And, you point to something that I think was a distinguishing feature of the most recent election, and that is, whatever you want to say about MAGA, it's a coherent movement. The people who pay attention to it understand what it is. The Democrats didn't have a coherent ideology. They didn't have a coherent platform that people could understand what they were all about. Just look at Kamala Harris herself. She flip-flopped on every key policy position that she held, both prior to and during the Biden administration. She flipped on it. Everything from fracking to transgender ideology to you name it. And
Open borders.
Open borders. I mean, it got to the point where she was asked, and I think this is what really was maybe the dagger to the heart of her campaign, was when she was asked, I believe it was on The View. She was asked whether in the past 3.5 years she would have done anything different than what the Biden administration did. And she said no, while at the same time going around telling everybody in her distinctive word salad way of saying, well, actually, I'm not part of, I'm something new. I'm not part of the Biden administration. Well, which is it, Kamala? With MAGA, the message was always very clear and consistent. What MAGA stood for, and I think people got onto that. The other really key thing that Donald Trump did this time versus in 2020, in 2020 it was all about Donald Trump, and that really created a difficult dilemma for voters, because there were people who would vote just to vote against Donald Trump. He's that type of a figure. People might say the same thing about me. You either love me or you hate me. But the thing is, what he did this time, which was very astute, was he created a coalition. It wasn't just Donald Trump. Now you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has very different ideas than Trump on many things. You had Elon Musk and his many millions of followers. And this is the man of the age. This guy's building spaceships to go to Mars. He's building rockets that land themselves. He is the champion of free speech on this platform of X, and then he brings in Tulsi Gabbard, you know, there was a coalition there, so that it touched on many different points. So that even if you didn't necessarily like everything about Donald Trump, maybe you really like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the things that he had to say about health, about vaccines, and things of that nature. You really like Vivek Ramaswamy and his, you know, his very sensible approach to economics, or Elon Musk, you know, and
Exactly.
what he
Yeah.
stands for. I think those were key things. The other big thing, and I experienced it myself, was faith. The leaders of the MAGA in the Trump campaign were not afraid to talk about God. I watched a video of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Maybe you saw this one, David, where he said during COVID he was praying for a leader, an American leader, who would come along and you know, save America from
Indeed.
this madness of
Yes.
vaccines. And I think that was huge for many voters.
Indeed. I think, to be blunt, they threw everything, including the kitchen sink, when it came to lawfare charges that had no basis in law whatsoever, at Donald Trump. And he also walked the path of a bullet going through one of his ears and seeing through the bushes another second assassin on a golf course. And I think people kind of figured out that, you know, he doesn't, what person would ever do this and stand for president? They could have just retired in their fancy place in Florida, but they continued on despite all the endless attacks. And I think at some point there was a kind of a resonation of authenticity, because if we look at the stats of people who are low propensity voters, people that have not voted for 20 years,
Right. Mm-hmm.
they're appearing in my statistics here on Rasmussen. It's very unusual because they recognize someone who said, oh my gosh, finally there's someone standing up for us, the little people, and I'm going to take a risk on that. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic, and I'm not sure if we understand that yet, but it's kind of historic. There's a number of other comments. Carrie Jepson says, so many tentacles of government makes easy for corruption. Exactly right, Carrie. If the state gets too big and complex, no one can manage it, and there's lots of opportunities for corruption. Susanna says she was not ready to be a candidate for president, referring to, of course, Vice President Harris.
We heard that
Gary,
about somebody else sometime around 2015. Wasn't that the
isn't that
campaign?
something?
He's not ready.
Isn't that interesting? And Gary says maybe not dump, but cut back to CRA. So a qualification on that earlier comment. Another comment from Susanna. This time is not only about Donald Trump. They can't demonize his entire teams the way they demonized Mr. Trump. Exactly right. So, you know, let us shed the kind of simple binary thinking, black and white thinking of what things are at. But this is why this conversation is so important. So I urge the audience to like it, share it, because we've got to wrap our heads around this as Canadians. I think there's great urgency to figure this out. A lot of in the legacy media have not been helpful. They totally don't understand the mega movement at all. They're still thinking it in very simplistic terms. They don't have a hot clue what it's about. So Eleanor says, yes, that is so true. It is very rare to hear Canadians talk about God, and in the United States, it is so common. It is what we need to hear, and in the world. Yeah, so regardless of your person of faith or not, we do need to think about larger purposes in life, the divine. We're all created as image bearers, so let us treat each other with respect. And so it's very interesting. So we've got a lot of cabinet appointments that are being lined up. We'll see how they're confirmed or go to work. It's interesting, in the National Post, there was an excellent article on Tuesday, November the 19th. Trump cabinet picks are no fans of Trudeau. And I think that's kind of what your point was, Leighton. So we've got, let's just go through a couple here. J.D. Vance, he's what's known as the vice president. He's a former senator. And J.D. Vance said, no more free rides. And I think that was relative to the slackers in Canada that ride in NATO. Find a better man. He's terrible. That's wow. I didn't realize that Tom
Holman.
Homan, the border czar, said that about Trudeau himself. And then Marco Rubio, proposed candidate for Secretary of State, no less, on the northern border. He said possibility of terrorists.
Yep.
Not a good spot to be in. The progressive mess it's in. Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor, and he's referring to the Canadian scene, of course. And then, of course, we've got the famous Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's nominated for health. And his comment about Canada that's famously quoted and you alluded to was, "Go truckers, go,"
Yeah.
referring to the truckers convoy. And of course, we've got Tulsi Gabbard, head of national intelligence on Trudeau, refers to him as anti-freedom and anti-democracy. Wow, these are some pretty edgy comments about our prime minister. So, man, are those even fair? What do you think, audience? You know, so as we look at the confirmation game, you mentioned as well that Matt Gaetz, a famous congressman for, I think it's Attorney General he was nominated for, has just withdrawn this morning. So that's interesting. But I noticed a playbook that some of these cynical actors play. And I remember it well as a kid because I actually watched some of these hearings. It's kind of crazy. But how they do it's familiar playbook, how they try to ruin people with rumors and lies. It's just awful. Like what they did to the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, right? Which was proven again, in fact, that the accusations were not true. And more recently, the hearings about Brent Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court Justice, total fabrication. So, gosh, what do you expect to happen in these confirmation hearings, Leighton, going forward? More games? Will the Democrats come up and say, "Well, you know what, our country's in trouble. Let's work together as a team and let's try to help"? Or are they just going to keep undermining and backbiting behind the scenes and continuing on with the usual playbook?
Well, I think the Democrats. I don't think they are able to learn. I had somebody on my show who described the Democrats stopping doing what they're doing, like trying to teach your kid to stop sucking their thumb. I don't think that they can stop. I think it's a compulsion. A couple of other interesting features of these appointments, David. One is that Jamil Javani, who is a recent member of Parliament, who
Yes.
I predict is going to play a key role in the CPC for Pierre Poilievre. He's a Yale Law classmate of J.D.
Yes,
Vance.
yes.
And so I want to come back to that and ask you a question about that, because you're more in the know about the CPC than I am. But the other one that's a key connection for Canada is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. I got to know Jay. I call him Dr. Jay very well. He was the expert witness in our Ingram case and also in a couple of others during the lockdowns. Just a brilliant guy, highly ethical, eloquent, and a Christian. He's being touted.
Yes.
He's being touted. This is one of the three framers of the Great Barrington Declaration. He was heavily censored during COVID, but he's slated to take over Dr. Fauci's old spot at the NIH. And people should understand this is really key, because the NIH, that nobody anywhere in the United States gets a research grant unless it goes through the NIH. So unless Dr. Fauci approved, and this is part of the problem that we've had with science in the U.S. and elsewhere, is the power that office holds. Well, Jay Bhattacharya has a very close Canadian connection, and so that will be very interesting if he's in basically the most important health spot in the world, how that's going to impact Canada, because I know Jay has very particular views about Theresa Tam and others. But coming back to Jamil Javani and the CPC, the Frontier hosted...
Maybe I could just mention that,
Sure.
Yes, Jay Bhattacharya and that whole team of people are certainly very good friends. And I would say that would be a remarkable
Yeah.
turn of events
Yeah.
with a senior appointment. I think we'll be pleasantly surprised by that. But yes,
Yeah.
very promising.
Yeah. But you had, the Frontier had Pierre Poilievre it seems to me about a year and a half ago at a speaking engagement. And some of the people who are very, let's say, connected and even prominent within that party. And I'm curious to know, David, do you think that the Trump administration and the Trump agenda, which we've talked about, is going to influence the course for the CPC? In other words, do you think that Pierre Poilievre and his party are going to sort of tailor their policies to sort of build on the popularity of MAGA? Or do you think that it'll be business as usual in Canada, that they'll tweak things a little bit, maybe be more responsible fiscally, but that, in terms of social policy and things like that, not too much is going to change in Canada? What is your take on that?
I don't know. I think what's going to happen, though, is that regardless of what party is in power, they will be like a gravitational pull, be influenced profoundly by a new Trump administration and something deeper that's going on. So it will be both policy and culture. So on the policy side, for instance, again, if taxes are changed, and they will be, and energy policy and sweeping changes in regulation, and the opportunity for the United States to go forward decisively on the economy and the stock market, the way it's behaving, in my opinion, is a foreshadow of that. Canada will be forced to move in those directions to be what is frankly the question of being competitive, period. On culture, though, I think there's a profound shift that's going on, a realization that this has just gone too far. The balance in the name of helping people that are, quote, oppressed has gone out of control. And so I think what you've got is possibly a kind of a rebalancing of all kinds of cultural institutions, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's academe, as the Trump administration will root out and not fund this endless DEI stuff. And that can't help but roll over the border, because ultimately this is the giant in the room that will affect kind of not just Canada, but the world. And I think that's where we're headed.
I agree. And the other thing, just as a corollary to that, so when you look at the Trump administration, J.D. Vance looms large. This is a president in waiting. This is a young man. He's Catholic. He's got a young family. He's a Yale Law graduate. Anybody who's seen him handle leftist media knows that he has a masterful ability to disarm interviewers. He's very clear thinking. And it's very likely that it's quite foreseeable, and that the Democrats, if you're a Democrat and you're listening to this, cover your ears. We might have 12 years of Republican governance.
Indeed, yes.
And that is quite foreseeable. J.D. Vance is no Mike Pence. He's not a Dan Quayle. He's a president in waiting. And of course, there are other people who are very strong conservatives who will challenge for the Republican nomination. Let's not forget about Ron DeSantis, or even someone like Vivek Ramaswamy. Would Elon Musk cannot run for president, but what if he aligns himself with one of these candidates the way he did with Trump? Right. We could be dealing with a Republican president in Washington for a very long time.
Indeed.
And if we continue with our current politics, which are really antithetical to the Trump administration, that simply is not sustainable. That's kind of the point that you're making, I think.
Exactly. There is another key appointment that was, I haven't before this air been able to confirm it. It's a very interesting appointment that I think is probably one of the most important ones, and that is a guy named Russell Vought. And he is likely to be the new Office of Management and Budget Director.
Yeah, okay.
And this is the pivotal position. I have watched him for years, and I think he will make an extraordinary impact on really right-sizing the state. And this is both at a macro level and a tactical level. So stay tuned. Again, that's Russell Vought. I got a comment here. Susanna says, the recent Mr. Trump victory will have a profound impact on Canadian politics. Personally, I believe it will help Canadians to restore a freedom and common sense in Canada. So thank you for that comment.
Mm.
Look, as we get kind of at the very tail end here, I guess one of the things that is very concerning as well, and it's not just the size of the state that a Trump administration confronts. I think it's a state or level of institutions, in my observations, and we know a lot of history the last 10 years here, of frankly deep corruption. I think if you look at the polls, the level of trust that Americans have for the FBI, the letter agencies, has never been lower. And
Mm.
there's reasons for that. I mean, there's so many examples. The whole Russia collusion hoax, which was founded on utter made up lies recycled out of Hillary Clinton's closet, to the so-called 52 intelligence leaders who came forward who said that there's nothing to see here in Hunter Biden's laptop. I mean, the stories are just legendary. And it is just a tragedy of Greek proportions that these institutions have been infected with advocates for DEI and frankly who have undermined the rule of law, that have become almost like an agency unto themselves, and hence the deep state. So, and I don't mean to sound conspiratorial, because it's not. It's all been there. The acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk, and the revelation that there are 83 agencies that have worked to systematically block, edit, censor all kinds of social media is just horrific. So how do you root out corruption here, Leighton Grey? I mean, you're a lawyer.
Mhm,
You've
mhm,
seen a lot in your experience as well. And
mhm,
how do you not seek revenge, but frankly accountability and justice
mhm,
for leadership, a leadership class that have lost the plot
mhm,
and basically need some measure of accountability here?
mhm.
What would
Well, I
you
think
do if you're advising Donald
mhm.
Trump?
Well, I think you said it, and it applies very much in the context of the United States, but perhaps more so in Canada. And what I would say is we have to restore meaningful application of the rule of law. You mentioned off the top of the show the resignation of Mr. Bissonnette, Minister Bissonnette from the Trudeau government. Um, this to me is, and really the Trudeau Liberals, to me, the characteristic feature of them is a lack of respect for the rule of law. This is the plot line running through everything that they do, from the Emergencies Act situation to SNC Lavalin to all of the other scandals. Justin Trudeau virtue signaling about climate change, telling parents they should care more about climate change than feeding their children, while he jets around the world, burning 35,000 liters of jet fuel on a single trip. Everything about the Liberals is an inversion and a perversion of the rule of law. Even the Bissonnette resignation is once again someone else taking a bullet for Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau never takes responsibility for anything that he's done. Honestly, if he were the right honorable Prime Minister of Canada, the honorable thing to do long ago is to resign and step down as Prime Minister, or at the very least, to call an election in a country which overwhelmingly does not approve of his leadership, even within his own party. And so the answer to your question for me is restoration of the rule of law. That is, and the rule of law means, folks, number one, that the law applies to everyone. Nobody is above the law, that we're all equal before the law, and that all of the way that we're going to apply the law is going to result in some semblance of what we all understand to be justice, not social justice, but actual justice, where we can look at decisions of courts, decisions of lawmakers, decisions of bureaucratic arbitrators, and say, yes, that is a sensible decision. That accords with our Canadian vision of what justice means. Right now, we don't have that. And that's the number one thing that we need to restore. And so much depends on it. Really, so much depends on it. Even when you get down to talking about the distinction between men and women, which might be the most foundational distinction we have in Western culture. Even that, to some degree, is a justice issue, right? Because When you start to blur the distinctions between men and women, that's when injustice creeps in. Just think of the example of sports, David, where you have men competing in women's sports. It's not only unjust, it's dangerous. It's perverted. It offends our sensibilities. So I think this is the number one thing we have to do in Canada. And I think that the Trump administration is devoted to that. And this is why Mr. Johnson came out recently and he said what he said. A man is a man, as a woman is a woman, and one can't be the other. We have to get back to restoring objective truth and the rule of law. And once we start to do that, I think we'll be on the right track to restoring some dignity to our culture and to our politics.
Well said, Leighton Grey. It's been a pleasure to have you on for this discussion with our audience. We've had fantastic comments and participation.
Have you ever?
All around.
Very, very, very smart people watching your show.
Yeah, we've got an amazing audience, people who participate every week, and it keeps on building. So it's really amazing. So share this with your friends, your family, fellow Canadians who believe that the change in the United States is both a challenge, but also an opportunity to build a better country, to renew it, both in terms of culture and policy. So thanks again, everybody, including Leighton Grey, for this conversation. We'll look forward to next week. Same time, same place, this Thursday. So please sure to join us, where we'll be having a special book launch about the second edition of A Critical Examination of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So be sure to join us. So thank you, and have a terrific day, everybody.